So I wrote this book after, obviously, a career as an education reporter. I spent a lot of time working on stories about education, and then I was given an assignment to write about teacher quality by the New York Times Magazine. And I think that assignment made a lot of sense. The assumptions of the editor who made this assignment was that somebody who had spent 4 years of her life getting up every day to learn about education and write about it for a general audience would know something about teacher quality, which is clearly the work at the heart of education, right? There is no education without good teachers. But as I began this assignment, I started to realize that I had spent 4 years learning about education, and yet I knew nothing about teaching. And the fact that I knew so little about the work at education's heart really held me back from understanding education and held back my coverage. So I'm hoping that this book is my attempt to share what I learned about teaching and how it informed how I think about education. So the first thing that I learned, again, is everything I thought I knew about education was wrong when I started to learn about teaching. And I'll simulate for you a bit of the experience that I had in a second. But here are so everyone has heard of Chalkbeat. We have some great representation of Chalkbeat in the room. Raise your hand if you're with Chalkbeat. Awesome. At Chalkbeat, we say now, and this is sort of post my own personal revelation about what education is really about, that there are 5 storylines that we should always be covering. So we should always be writing about teaching and learning. We should always be writing about politics and policy making, but also bureaucracy and operations, the structures that deliver services to kids. We should be writing about the out-of-school context, what students bring from home to school and how that creates certain opportunities and challenges. And then educational tools, the stuff that makes up school day, like assessments, curriculum materials, textbooks. But before I took on this assignment to write about teacher quality, here are the 5 storylines that I actually wrote about. I think politics and policymaking is really, really important, but it has to be informed by an understanding of all the other 4 pieces of the puzzle, because all of this matters. So let me simulate for you what some of my aha moments were that helped me change the way I understood teaching. So we're going to do this I'm going to assign you guys 3 problems in a row. Are you ready? That was not that enthusiastic. Are you ready? More math. Okay. Does anyone agree with that? Yes. I think we have unanimous agreement, including with this car. The answer is 245. Second question, why would a child think that 49 times 5 equals 405? Any ideas?
They know that 9 times 5 is 45, and they think it should have 3 digits.
So they know that 9 times 5 is 45, and they say, well, 45, and their understanding of 45 is to write 40 followed by 5. That's a possibility. Yeah? Maybe they don't see the numbers in the right way. Maybe. Well, let me show you. Let's walk through what was going on here. Before we walk through what's going on here, I'm going to give you a 3rd problem, and then we will walk through what's going on here. Which of the following 2 people do you think is most likely to know the answer to this question? Why would a child think that 49 times 5 equals 405? Option A is Hyman Bass. He is a world-renowned mathematician who is known for inventing a new field of algebra. Did you know that algebra has multiple fields within it? I did not. So that's option A. He actually lives not far away from here in Ann Arbor, where he's a professor jointly of mathematics and education. And option B is a woman named Deborah Ball, who in her heyday, when she was pictured here, was an elementary school teacher known for a very creative bake sale that she put on which required her to entrepreneurially locate a stove that was on the street, abandoned, and she dragged that stove into her classroom and was able to use that to help her students bake and teach them math in the process. So we can have a vote. This is the problem. Which of these two people is most likely to know the right answer? The brilliant mathematician or the elementary school teacher? Who votes for A, Hyman Bass? Okay, 2 people. Who votes for B, Deborah? Some of you have read the book, so you know that the answer is Deborah Ball. And actually, it was Deborah Ball who showed me this problem in the first place. She and Hyman Bass actually collaborated to study the work, the knowledge that is required in order to teach effectively, even to teach elementary school students math. And what they found is that when you give problems like this to 2 groups of people, on one hand, mathematicians like Hyman, and on the other hand, effective elementary school math teachers like Deborah, the elementary school teachers outperform the mathematicians. Why? Because knowing a subject well is not enough to teach it. There is a separate but related domain of knowledge that is required in order to teach. A teacher has to confront mistakes that children make every day, diagnose the underlying misunderstanding, which was challenging to all of you, and don't worry, also challenging to Hyman Bass, a mathematician, and then figure out not only what was going wrong in that student's mind, but also what the teacher could do to change that. What kind of learning experience can the teacher provide to help the student think differently? So I see Emily is already thinking through. So let's walk this through. Let's remember what the standard algorithm is for calculating 49 times 5. So first you multiply 5 and 4 to get 20, and then you add the 4 to get 24. Does this help anyone see what might have gone wrong if a student was following the conventional algorithm but made a slight mistake? 5 times 8 is 40, so how would you get 8? How would the student get 8? So if the student had carried the 4 correctly, but then instead of remembering that first 5 was multiplied times 4, and then adding the 4, instead adding the 4 and the 4 to get 8, multiplying by 5 to get 40. So a teacher not only has to figure out what was going on here, but then take a second step, which I'll challenge all of you to think about. Why would a child not understand this algorithm? What is the fundamental underlying misunderstanding here? It has to do with what Emily said. I don't remember why the 4 is carried. If a child is just following the procedures without thinking, the piece of the puzzle that she is missing is place value. So the 4 that's carried does not get added to the 4 because the child is not understanding place value. So what does this mean for us as education reporters and for education? The conclusion I hope I've made really clear is that teaching requires specialized knowledge that you can't just be really smart. Even really, really, really smart people like Hyman Bass, who invent new fields of algebra, cannot figure these problems out on their own. Those of us in this room are not unique in that. Teachers all will need to learn this special knowledge and skill to teach. But we do very little in this country to support teachers in acquiring that knowledge and skill. Very little. You've heard a lot about that at this conference, so I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm happy to talk about that more. A few bullet points. One is think about pre-service. We've talked a lot at this conference about what happens before teachers enter the classroom and they're getting prepared to teach. Well, very little time is spent on preparing them with this kind of knowledge and this kind of skill. Instead, there's been a tradition of education research and teacher preparation that focuses on what one scholar that I write about in my book called anything but pedagogy. So anything but teaching. Researchers will study the history, psychology, economics, sociology of education before they study teaching itself. And so teachers are not prepared with the raw knowledge and skills that they need to teach. The second piece is once teachers get into the classroom. Once teachers get into the classroom and into schools in this country, they're very isolated. In fact, somebody I spoke to for my book told me a story of when he was inducted into the profession by his mentor. We've heard a lot about mentorship and induction here. His mentor teacher told him that she was required to observe him because it was part of the law, but she really apologized for having to do it. She said watching somebody else teach is kind of embarrassing because teaching is the second most private act, she said. So in this country, not only do we prepare teachers around anything but teaching, but we then, once they get into the classroom, treat teaching like Victorian-era sex. It is off-limits, private. So what does this mean for education? What are the consequences? One set of consequences has to do with some of the charts that we as reporters get to see that are produced from research studies about what are the levels of learning happening in American classrooms. So this is one of the findings from the MET report, the Measures of Effective Teaching study, which was the most large-scale study of American classrooms ever conducted. The Gates Foundation supported this study. It looked inside 3,000 classrooms and got not only the achievement data of the students in those classrooms, but also thousands of hours of videotape of these teachers teaching. And then researchers looked at that videotape and scored it according to several rubrics, which were looking for levels of both teaching skill and academic learning by students. And the findings, as you can see, is that the researchers found almost no evidence or limited evidence of pretty much every high-level academic skill that the Common Core says we should be seeing in American schools. So students, there was very low levels of classroom discourse, meaning academic conversations that students engaged in with each other about academic topics, very low levels of intellectual challenge. So this is one of the consequences of a system of education that fails to prepare teachers to help students understand. What's another consequence? This is not a chart, but a story. The A&W restaurant chain in the 1980s decided that it was going to do something exciting and compete with McDonald's. They were going to compete with the McDonald's Quarter Pounder hamburger, and they had a foolproof plan for doing that. They were going to release a burger that was larger than the Quarter Pounder. It was a third a pound of meat instead of a quarter. They were going to have it be the same price, so more meat for just the same amount of money, and it was going to taste better. And in fact, they did taste tests with lots of different focus groups, and they found that every time the A&W third pounder was tastier than the McDonald's Quarter Pounder. They topped off this foolproof plan with a large-scale marketing plan to market this burger, and yet they found nobody bought it. Nobody wanted to buy it. And the A&W executives were really confused until they did a second round of focus groups, and they heard the same thing from every customer. They said, why should we pay the same amount for a third of a pound of meat as we do for a quarter pound at McDonald's? The customers thought that a third was smaller than a quarter and that they were being charged the same amount for less burger because 3 is smaller than 4. So this is what it means in real life to have low levels of academic rigor. Another piece of what this looks like, so one question we could pose is, why is it that Americans got that problem wrong? Perhaps maybe just Americans cannot do math very well, right? Or cannot, and maybe most children can't think at very high levels. Maybe abstract thinking is something that only some of us can do. Well, researchers looked at an interesting experiment in Brazil. They found that children who worked on the streets of Brazil to help support their families by selling fruit and nuts on the street were doing surprisingly complicated amounts of math in their head just to do their job. So, for example, researchers observed one little boy selling coconuts. The boy he knew that the price was 35 cruceros per coconut, and he knew that the customer wanted 4 coconuts. So the researchers watched as he accurately calculated the price that he should charge the customer, 140 in his head. He went through the steps, he made logical reasoning, and he got to the right answer. And researchers watched as children did this over and over again. Every calculation they observed was accurate in the children's head. But then they did a twist on this observation. They did an intervention. They said, what if we give the children the same problem that they've just done in their heads on paper, in the language of school? So for example, after watching this little boy calculate the right price of coconuts, they pulled him aside 5 minutes later and wrote down the problem that he had just solved in his head on paper. 35 times 4. And as he walked through the steps, the same thing happened that had happened every time the researchers did this with children in the language of school. The same problem they had just accurately solved in their heads, when it was put on paper in the language of school, they got it wrong. And two things about this really blow my mind. One is that, first of all, children are capable of a lot. The problem is not the kids. The problem is school. School has turned math into something that makes no sense. And we could tell similar stories for other subjects. The second thing that blows my mind is look at the error that the little boy made here. So just to remind you, the right answer is 140, but what did he do wrong to get 200? He did the exact same thing that other kid did. And when I saw this in the research, my mind was blown, because what this means is that it might seem complicated to us to have to be to imagine every single teacher having to diagnose every single idiosyncratic misunderstanding, right? There's not this 35 times 4 or that 49 times 5. That's just one problem by one student in one day of 1 week of one school year. How many other wrong errors is a teacher going to have to encounter? It seems impossible that a teacher could actually know all of these wrong errors. Well, the reality is that kids repeat the same mistakes over and over again. We can actually predict the errors that students will bring to academic content. It is possible to say this is a body of knowledge that all teachers should know, and we can prepare you to know it. I was just a journalist reading a research paper when I encountered this mistake, but because I had been explained to about the 49 times 5, I knew why the student got this wrong. So it is possible to do something. But what do we do? There are two main arguments that are on the table that all of us are covering as journalists about what to do about improving the levels of education and the levels of teaching in this country. The first I call accountability. We cover this every day. The nouns you might think of are teacher evaluation policies or assessments. And the idea is that we can improve teaching by doing what Michelle Rhee is pictured in this infamous Time magazine cover story. We can sweep away the bad teachers. So the idea is that we can identify how teachers are performing, right, by evaluating them according to their students' success, and then we can take the bad performers and remove them. So by holding teachers accountable for students' results, we will remove the bad teachers, have better teachers overall, and things will improve. So that's argument number one. This is the solution, accountability. The second argument, usually proposed as a counter-argument to accountability, is autonomy. And this is often put forward by teachers' unions in the local community. They will say, the problem is not a lack of accountability, it's too much accountability. Teachers are drowning in bureaucracy and rules and assessments which hold them back from doing what they know how to do, what they know is best for children. So what we should do is, as this Daily News columnist wrote, we should free the teachers. So how many people have heard these two arguments and covered these two arguments? They're pervasive. It's everything we hear. But let's put both of these arguments against this idea that we've just acknowledged, that teaching requires specialized knowledge and skill. Will either of these be enough to help teachers acquire that knowledge and skill? I say no. I don't think so. I think that accountability fundamentally depends on the idea that teachers will figure this out on their own. If all we are doing is identifying the bad teachers and doing nothing to help everyone else do better, this will not work. Similarly, leaving teachers to figure out how to teach on their own, to do what they know is best, is just as absurd. Because the reality is there are common things we can predict that teachers need to know and be able to do in order to teach responsibly. So forcing them to figure out all of that on their own is not fair either, and it will not solve our problem. So what's a different approach? I write in my book about Japan as one example. In Japan, unlike here, where we treat teaching like Victorian-era sex or a private act, the Japanese treat teaching like a public good. So this is a lesson that I attended as a reporter, and you can see I was not the only one attending it. Many people were attending it, and this is a common occurrence in Japanese schools, that outsiders, whether it's fellow teachers from that school or from another part of the district or even from another part of the country, regularly come to watch each other teach. And then afterwards, after they watch the lesson, they talk about it. They have group discussions, sometimes small over tea and then later beer, or sometimes huge, like this auditorium. And what happens during these discussions is that they create new knowledge about teaching. They share ideas with one another. And a key piece of this, because lots of Americans have tried to get us to just have teachers talk to each other and create professional learning communities, but very little professional learning results from these experiments. We all know that as reporters, we've covered that. Well, one feature that makes sure that professional learning does happen in Japan is that professors of education actually are part of this too. So there's both a conversation among practitioners and also outside experts. So that guy on the right, he's a professor of education. He was watching a lesson. He noticed certain things about what students were learning and what they weren't, and he was part of the discussion. It was his job to be part of the discussion to help build knowledge about what they all could have done better. So what does this mean? It means that innovation happens within the practice of teaching, within the community of teachers in Japan, in pretty impressive and exciting ways. Some of these are really small little ideas that get taken up and quickly expanded. So for example, this is one classroom that I saw. Can you see my little mouse? This is a lesson that I saw where something common was here. Can you guess what these little things here are? I know it's in Japanese, but just take a guess. Standards. What an American idea. Standards? No. Any other ideas? Labels of the steps? No. People's names? Yeah. Kids' names. So these are little magnets on which are pre-printed children's names. And my understanding is that these first emerged in one teacher's classroom as a solution to a very practical real-life teaching problem. The problem was, okay, in the Japanese lesson, the blackboard is really important. They actually have a whole word just to describe the art of blackboard writing in Japanese. It's called bansho. In Japan, this professional community creates not just a lot of learning opportunities, but a technical vocabulary to describe pieces of teaching that we don't have words for in English. So, it's like Eskimos and snow, or Californians and wine, or, I don't know, Detroit people and cars, maybe. What the problem was, part of the bansho writing, blackboard writing science involved having students' contributions shared amongst, on the blackboard, so ideas could be shared. And what the teachers would have to do is write by hand the name of the student who had shared her idea on the board. But that was like a small inefficiency, and the Japanese are very careful about efficiency. So one teacher had the idea of, instead of writing the child's name every time she has an idea, why don't we pre-print their names on magnets, put them alongside the right hand of the chalkboard, and then attach them to the idea when it comes up. Not only was this slightly more efficient, it also created a new teaching strategy, which was students could be rewarded for every time their idea was shared, and also everyone could keep a group count of who had participated and who hadn't. because all of the names were on the right-hand side until you shared. And you can also see it even keeps track of gender participation. So some are blue and some are pink. So one teacher had this idea, and because lessons are treated as public goods, other teachers, can you stop doing that? It's freaking me out. Observed that and were able to take up that idea in their own classrooms, and suddenly the idea really spread. Another example, Japanese teachers, by working together, are able to think together about what are the best problems to help students encounter the right ideas. So subtraction with regrouping, you guys remember from school, is when the number on the bottom is bigger than the number on top. So it would be easier to do 16 minus 1 than 11 minus 6, right? So how do you get students to help think about how do I do subtraction with regrouping or borrowing? Well, through practice and observing each other, Japanese teachers have all singled on the same one problem that is the most effective way to teach this idea. That is what collective study of teaching produces. So what would it take to create Japanese conditions in the US? A quick story. This is a woman, Magdalene Lambert, who you guys saw speak yesterday. She was really at her wit's end in the midway through her career. She had a bit of a crisis of confidence in the ability of American education system to scale excellent teaching. She thought, we don't have the systems to do it. Higher education isn't set up to do it. K-12 isn't set up to do it. I'm at a loss. Maybe it's just impossible for every teacher to be great. Maybe it just needs to be isolated maestros, and that's all the best we can do. So she did what any professor with a problem does. She took a sabbatical in Italy, where her plan was to drink wine and learn Italian. And she did this. She really did this. She went to Rome. You can do this if you're a professor. We could learn a lot from that industry as journalists. And she's in this Italian class when she has an epiphany. It was a small moment, not one that you or I might have acknowledged, but it was important to her. She was being taught a lesson, she and her classmates in this Italian school, and 15 minutes through the lesson, the teacher left the room. 1 minute later, he came back, and he gave them a new task. That was it. That was the whole thing that caused her epiphany. Not really meaningful to me, but what was meaningful to Magdalene is that she's a great teacher, and she could recognize a fellow great teacher when she saw one. What this teacher had done was he had assessed what everyone in the room understood about the topic they were learning and decided that they were all struggling with the same problem. He had been trying to teach them about verbs, but really they had a problem with subject agreement. So he switched the task in response to their struggle, brought in a new task, and changed the lesson. So that was really notable because this was a teacher who was really engaging with students' thinking, really addressing their challenges and learners. And then the second epiphany came as she spent more time at the school. Because the way the school is structured, you didn't just have one teacher, you had many teachers. They cycled on 3 to 4 week cycles. So the same class would get a new teacher every 3 to 4 weeks. And every time they got a new teacher, it was the same great teaching that this first guy had had. It was exactly what she thought was impossible. It was happening in Italy. She came to describe what was going on as infrastructure. She thought what made that possible was infrastructure. So what does that mean? In transportation, infrastructure is all of the stuff that's pretty invisible to us that allows all of us to get from all parts of the country a few days ago and be here seamlessly today, right? It's traffic lights, Uber apps, airline, FAA regulations, all of bridges, all of these things conspire to help us do a complicated thing of moving ourselves around. Well, at Italia IDEA, the same thing existed to support the complex work of teaching and learning. There were a set of invisible supports that made this possible. This is a diagram that one of the professors of education that I write about in my book created to help visualize educational infrastructure. One feature that she saw at Italia IDEA was material and technical resources. So why was the teacher able to leave the room 15 minutes in? It was because there was a lesson bank that existed in the school where all the teachers had compiled good lessons that helped tasks that address students' common misunderstandings. So if you have the problem of 49 times 5 equals 405 because they don't get place value, here's a good lesson to use. Or if they're struggling with subject-verb agreement, here's a good lesson. And the teachers created this together. Another feature of the infrastructure, teacher education and professional development. So this Italian school actually had an entire school that existed just to prepare teachers to teach. A whole teacher education program that was solely focused on teaching. Not anything but only teaching. Finally, the organization of teachers' time. They had enough time that they could build a materials, the lesson bank, together. That was part of their job. In this country, in K-12 schools, teachers spend an average of 1,000 hours a year in front of students teaching. In countries that outperform us, it's almost half of that. That leaves a whole 400 plus hours that they can spend learning about their teaching. So these are the features that she noticed there. This is what I think all of us are writing about. We're writing about people who are building this infrastructure. It's more complicated than the narrative that's very simple that we're often compelled to tell by the powers that be. It's not just accountability, it's not autonomy, but it's supports that allow people to learn, teachers to learn, and students to learn. So I'm sorry, I think I've gone terribly over time, but I'm going to stop here. And if you have questions, I hope I can answer them. Thank you.